This is Reese Brady dictating field report number 6, I guess, for the Pilgrim File. Back in civilization, such as it is, Mr. Clark and Mr. Akers wanted all hands on deck in Chicago for the two doctors' disappearance. Been in my hotel room for 4 days with nothing to do. The firm has more than enough junior associates. While I'm in town, I'm going to investigate an anomalous record. I couldn't place it in the Nash timeline, but from some of the names mentioned, I believe I've identified the location in which the narrative takes place. Verifying this hunch will take more than 8 hours there and back, but I've spoken with Knox, and she agrees that it's worth it. Of course, she's too busy to help.
I should have never agreed to use my car. I'll tell you that for sure. I'm lying here in a hospital bed. I'm missing fingers. I've got no job, no prospects. And now I can't even drive myself out of this cursed city. I'm not kidding. This whole city is cursed. I wish I'd never, ever come here in the first place. The second I can walk, I'm going to walk out of this hospital. And then I'm going to walk out of this city. I'll go sleep in the cornfields they've got out there. I don't care. Not after what I've seen. My name is Louis Miner. I grew up out east, but I moved here when I left the Air Force. I landed a good job with a gas company based in Whitmer, and I thought I had a future here. I lost that job last year with all the layoffs and downsizing that's been going on since right before Reagan took office. Ever since that happened, I've been kind of bumping along the bottom of the job market. For the first couple of months of unemployment, I was living off of my savings. I looked for work, but it was slim pickings, especially for someone without a college degree. My time in the Air Force and my minimal resume amounted to squat after I'd lost the job at the gas company. That's how I ended up in the employ of Russ Strobe. That's how I ended up getting mixed up with that bunch of rich, drunk Satanists. That's what they all turned out to be. I answered a notice in the papers put out by Russ Strobe's property manager, Ted Bodo. The Strobe estate is one of the bigger ones up on the northern bank. Bodo runs Strobe's estate. He oversees all us guys, the drivers, the gardeners, and the part-timers like me. Bodo was my direct boss. Bodo gave me work as a part-time flunky, basically. I wasn't one of the drivers or gardeners or anything like that. He already had plenty of guys doing that. Bodo hired me to do casual labor. If there was a random, time-consuming task that Bodo didn't want to do, the agreement was he could pick up the phone and send me to do it. I didn't like being Bodo's errand boy, but I needed the work and the pay was all right. Most of the tasks I was given by Bodo were mundane. There were several times I was tasked with riding in a delivery truck with the head gardener to go pick up bags of mulch or some other landscaping materials. One weekend, I had to clean the outdoor pools when the regular groundskeeper was on vacation. I got paid to sit in my car for 2 whole days and read a book because they had a tree expert come out to douse a couple of the gigantic oaks on the estate with an exceedingly poisonous pesticide. They needed someone to do nothing but sit there for a couple of days and make sure nobody walked up and touched the trees with their hands while the chemicals settled. A lot of the work Bodo gave me was in the evenings as a helper for the waiters and caterers whenever there was a party on the Strobe estate. Russ Strobe is part of the city's upper echelon and has a very active social life. There were a lot of gatherings and social events at the estate. Strobe and his wife hosted other high society folks at his main house. Several times throughout the spring and fall, there were evening dinner parties in one of the estate's gardens. My job was to help set up for the parties, serve the food, and then be part of the cleanup team after all the guests had gone home. On the less innocuous, more disconcerting end of the spectrum, I had to serve as an extra hand at Russ Strobe's private men-only parties that he threw on occasion. These parties were attended only by Strobe and his inner circle of friends, which was made up of bankers, business magnates, and members of the local political machinery. Strobe would attend these without his wife. All his rich guy friends showed up stag as well. These parties would always be outdoors somewhere, usually held at a place outside the city on a wooded property that Strobe or one of his buddies owned. The parties were typically given in a clearing in the woods. I and several other hired hands would get there first in a couple of delivery trucks. We would haul out the equipment for a temporary field kitchen and set up a bunch of picnic tables and chairs. Someone would show up with a refrigerated truck loaded with steaks, booze, and beer. The members of Strobe's men's club would arrive, and we would serve them a sumptuous dinner. The food was cooked right there under the stars. We would keep the drinks flowing for these guys often into the early hours of the morning. But these weren't simply dinner parties. The fun wasn't limited to eating and drinking. These parties always centered around Strobe and his companions dressing up in bizarre costumes and acting out theatrical versions of ancient occult rituals. The way it would work is that the partygoers would arrive, have drinks, and be served dinner. Right around the time me and the other workers were clearing the dessert plates, a guy named Petrov Guy would show up at the party. He was a hippie with shaggy black hair who always wore a tattered, neck to ankle black tunic. He had a long, unruly beard that was streaked with gray that came most of the way down his chest. He was always decked out in a dozen different talismans, necklaces, bracelets, and rings. He had a small scarlet tattoo of a pentagram on his left cheekbone. Guy was never one of the dinner guests. He always appeared after they were done eating. He was there to provide the entertainment for these rich drunks. Guy's role at these gatherings was to serve as the occult master of ceremonies. Whether there were sigils to be painted on trees, or a ceremonial fire to be tended, or arcane incantations to be led in ancient Persian or Latin, it was Guy who did so. Whatever ritual he was conducting, Guy always officiated it in a most grave and somber manner. Strobe and the other attendees, on the other hand, were never as particularly reverent as Guy was while he was doing his act. They would have great fun trying to follow along, but mostly they just laughed and drank through the whole thing. Like us, Petrov Guy was nothing more than a hired hand. But what made Petrov Guy different from the rest of the men at the party was that Guy did such a convincing job of making it seem he actually believed in the spells and rituals he would carry out for paying customers like Strobe. If Guy did not believe in any of the hocus pocus he practiced and professed, if this was no more than a charade to bilk rich buffoons of their expendable cash, Guy certainly had everyone fooled. He very convincingly looked and played the part of a practitioner of dark arts and a devotee of the occult. I have been to church services. Once, when I was in the Air Force, a fellow recruit who had grown up on the Kiowa reservation out west let me join him in a sweat lodge ceremony. I've seen Satan-worshipping rituals portrayed in horror movies, but the rituals and ceremonies I saw acted out at Strobe's stag parties, led by Guy, were like nothing I'd ever seen or heard of before. Each party had a different theme, and the attendees would arrive in matching costume for it. The first one I can remember working at, they all showed up dressed in long linen tunics, and each attendee wore a fez upon his head. The owner of the property we were on that night had built a replica of an Egyptian pyramid. It was made of stone and was almost 20 feet high from the ground to its tip. The pyramid was covered in a veneer of limestone so that it glowed eerily in the moonlight. It was surrounded by a colonnade of ornate statues. All the statues had the body of a human being, but each had the head of a different animal. From where we were set up overlooking the spectacle, I could see the three statues closest to me. One had the head of a dog, another had the head of a lizard, and the one furthest from me had the head of an owl. Right after dinner, Guy led Strobe and his companions in an ancient nighttime funerary rite, complete with a torch-lit procession where they all carried a giant coffin through the woods. The coffin was carved from wood and covered in hieroglyphics. With many long prayers and incantations, they interred the coffin inside the pyramid. Then Guy led the men in a drunken procession, torches held aloft, while they circled the miniature pyramid 7 times, chanting and praying, stopping at the feet of each anthropomorphic statue to offer a fistful of burning incense. These parties were indeed strange, but I was not there to judge. Honestly, me and the other staff were usually too busy to witness most of what was happening anyway. I just figured it was how these fellows bonded, to have drinking parties out in the middle of nowhere that centered around putting on a masquerade of pagan worship. It was something Strobe and his circle of friends got a kick out of. It gave their group a type of cohesion that I guess they weren't able to get anywhere else. If any of Guy's ceremonies were supposed to have a particular climax, it never seemed to happen. The parties never ended with a fantastic burst of sparks and a devil appearing in its midst. Nobody was turned into animals and sent running around howling at the moon. The stars never fell out of the sky. The soirees always just kind of petered out at sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. One by one, the partygoers grew tired, said their goodbyes, and had their chauffeurs drive them home. In the end, it was always me and the other servants cleaning up the mess and empty bottles in the dark, exhausted, and ready to go home ourselves. Not that we did not have a little fun with Petrov Guy. We would wait until the partygoers had all left. As we finished packing everything up, each one of us had our line we would repeat almost every time, like little rituals themselves. The cook would always say to Petrov Guy, "Hollywood's calling, you're a hit." The driver I always rode with would yell over to Guy as we were loading the picnic tables back into the truck, "Well, Guy, you almost had me convinced." I myself would wait until everyone else had piled into the trucks. Then I would walk right up to Guy and interrupt whatever he was doing. I would ask in a hushed and conspiratorial tone, "Did it work this time?" Petrov Guy never entertained any of us with an answer. He was always still there when we left. I never actually saw him leave before I and the other servants finally hopped back in the delivery trucks and drove away. His rituals never seemed to be completed. He kept going with whatever it was he had started. Once, I watched Guy in the side view mirror of the truck I had hitched a ride back to the city in. I remember Guy growing smaller and smaller in the mirror as he frantically paced in circles around a burning pentagram in the leaves at his feet, his arms gesticulating up at the treetops and the stars. Guy was certainly committed to character, as professional actors would say, inordinately so. A few weeks ago, while it was still very cold and the city was in the depths of the type of long winters that occur up here, Bodo had called me. He said on the phone that he wanted me to use my car to pick up a large batch of champagne from one of the buildings at the estate. I was then supposed to drive the trunkload of champagne out to a soiree that Strobe was having with a bunch of his rich friends for their rich guy only club. When I asked Bodo where he wanted the hooch delivered, he told me to drive it out onto the lake. The lake was still completely frozen over when this happened. It was 10 inches thick as far as 3 miles from the shoreline. People were driving their cars out onto the ice over lake for fun. Strobe's party was happening out on the ice, about 2 miles from shore, just before sunset. Bodo's directions to the party told me how to find where Strobe and his friends were all meeting up. There was a particular dock at a public beach. Basically, I just drove straight out onto the ice in the direction the dock was pointing. Bodo told me that there was enough snow on top of the ice that if I kept my own tire tracks in my rearview mirror, it should be enough to stay in a straight line out to the meetup point. It turned out that I did not need to do this. There were several tire tracks through the thin layer of snow on the ice already that I could follow. The wind kicked up way out on the lake and started blowing around gusts of snow and ice crystals. I had trouble seeing where I was headed, but I could still make out the faint impressions of tire tracks in front of me. So I kept driving. Eventually, a line of limousines parked in a semicircle came into sight. I pulled up with my load of champagne. There was no supper planned that night. Other than the chauffeurs and Guy, I was the only hired hand there. Strobe and his buddies were standing in a circle farther out onto the ice. Their chauffeurs had unrolled wool carpets right on top of the snow for these guys to stand on so their feet wouldn't get cold. The costume Strobe and his pals were all dressed up in that evening comprised fur coats and silk top hats. The top hats sat askew on several heads. They were all laughing and passing a bottle around. One of the chauffeurs beckoned me with a white-gloved hand to park at the end of the row of limousines. There was a camping table set up. Next to it was a large pile of snow that the chauffeurs had scraped into a mound. I was to embed most of the bottles of champagne in the pile of snow to keep cool and crack open 3 or 4 bottles to be served immediately. Pink-cheeked and in jolly humor, the partygoers came up to the table. Me and one of the chauffeurs got the champagne flowing into their glasses. While this was going on, Guy, who was wearing nothing on his feet but sandals, was roving around in circles across the ice. He had a can of blue spray paint, and he was doubled over, using it to paint large sigils in the snow. The symbols he painted are hard to describe. Most of them looked like the really complicated ones you'd find in an old book on witchcraft or sorcery. When Guy was done painting the last and largest sigil, he stood in the middle of it and hailed the group of partygoers. It took several attempts on his part before any of them took notice. When they did, I heard one of Strobe's friends suggest that every time they heard Guy belt out the words Apewin or Ball, all of them should take a swig of champagne. Every one of them laughingly agreed to this game, and then they sauntered over to join Guy. Once they were all assembled, Guy commenced a ritual. For most of it, Guy stood in a single spot, feet spread shoulder width, arms held aloft. He shrieked and howled long and unintelligible words into the sky. This act was interspersed with Guy falling face down onto the ice. He would press his face into the snow and holler some more. What he was saying was muffled because he would do this with his face pressed firmly into the ice, as if he was trying to get the fish to hear him. Then Guy would jump back up, resume his arms aloft pose, and would yell and scream multi-syllable gobbledygook into the chill air. I could see his breath rising up over his head in frosty plumes. Sure enough, whenever Guy shouted anything that sounded remotely like Apewin or Ball, all of the guests in their top hats and furs raised a glass, bellowed a huge hurrah, and took a drink. This performance went on for almost an hour. I stood at the table full of champagne bottles, blowing into my hands to keep them warm, and occasionally stomping my feet in an effort to get the frozen blood in them flowing again. The chauffeurs stayed bundled up inside their limousines. It started to get dark and a whole lot colder. Eventually, the partygoers began to get bored. Guy had stopped yelling and was standing stock still. He was motionless, holding up his arms. He had his back to Strobe and the other guests. He did not speak a word to them. The group went silent for about another minute after Guy started doing this. Then someone muttered something to the other men, and they all slowly dispersed to their waiting limousines. The limousine engines started up. Several chauffeurs reappeared. The table was refolded. The carpets were rolled up. The empty bottles and other trash were left where they lay. Headlights came on, and the vehicles all turned and headed back towards shore. I got in my own car, turned it on, and started blasting the heater. During all of this, Petrov Guy had not moved a muscle. When the last of the taillights disappeared into the west, I turned my engine off. The reason I got back out of my car was all those empty champagne bottles were worth something. I could get a nickel apiece if I gathered them up and took them back with me. Freezing, I wandered around, picking up the empty bottles and dumping them into my trunk. Petrov Guy still had not made any move to leave. I grabbed the last bottle and was about to depart. I yelled over to Guy that the party guests were all gone and he could knock off the act. There was no response. I walked over to where Guy stood. Mine was the only car still out there on the ice. I asked Guy if he needed a lift back to town. He kept standing there with his arms held up. He did not say anything back to me. Getting up close to him, I could see that frost from the blowing wind across the lake was gathering in his long matted hair and all over the back of his tunic. His feet looked like 2 blocks of ice. I started to get concerned for him. Standing in front of him and getting a good look at his drawn and haggard face, I could see that frost was caking on his eyelashes and beard. His eyes stayed open, unblinking. "Hey," I said, and waved my hand in front of his face. Guy did not move a muscle, but he looked at me and made direct eye contact. I started to ask him again if he needed a ride. Through gritted teeth, Guy started making a long, low, hissing noise at me. It lasted several seconds. Finally, without moving his lips, he hissed a single word at me. silence. I don't work for Petrovsky. He is not my boss. I did not take kindly to him giving me any kind of order like that. I held the last empty bottle up in front of his face. "Oops," I said, and let the bottle fall to the ice right at his feet. Still not moving, still not lowering his arms. Guy looked at me with an expression of complete and utter contempt. He hissed something else through his teeth, a full sentence. With Guy not moving his lips, it was hard to understand the words, but it might have been, "This time it worked." I stooped to pick up the bottle, and that is when I saw the unearthly glow of sickly green light emanating up from the waters below the ice. I straightened and jumped a little bit in shock and surprise at what I was seeing. The weird light from the frozen lake started getting brighter. Slowly, head down, I circled around Guy, looking down at what was glowing up at us from the ice. It was big and round. It was several car lengths in diameter. As I stared at it, I struggled to wrap my head around what exactly it was I was seeing. All at once, the silence of the night was shattered by a titanic groan that filled the air around us. It sounded to me like the whole earth was cracking in half. The ice shook beneath my feet. Guy started screaming. I started screaming. I was screaming because I'd suddenly realized what that thing was just below the ice. It was the iris and pupil of a gigantic eye. That is all I remember until I woke up here in the hospital. I was told that the ice had broken up that night, so nobody had any idea how I made it back to shore. I was found unconscious and completely frozen on the beach. At first, they thought I was dead. I was taken here to this hospital where I was slowly thawed out and my heart started beating again. It took a couple of days for me to regain my wits and my ability to talk. I asked for a phone. I used the hand that still has most of its fingers to make a call to Bodo at his office over at the Strobe estate. When I finally got Bodo on the line, the first thing he did was tell me I was fired for failing to show up to work. I tried to tell him what happened, but he made it clear he had no interest in hearing anything about it. I am completely certain that my car is at the bottom of that lake. I still have no idea what happened to Petrovsky.
I found the records of Mr. Miner's stay in the hospital, confirming the time and location of the events. This is a strong indicator that my concerns were correct. Up until this point, we have had no reason to believe that Nash was ever any farther north than Pittsburgh. Are we missing a section of his biography? If so, does that mean the client is lying to the firm? Or was the box of research notes collected by someone other than Nash? That might be even worse. Maybe I've been chasing the wrong failed novelist. This isn't the first time I've encountered a reference to Colin Hayes Booth, alias Petrov Guy, but it seems likely to be the last. As for the giant monster Mr. Miner claims to have encountered, I doubt we'll be able to connect it to the package. Nevertheless, for lack of anything better to do with this information, I've passed it on to Noah so they can... Actually, I have no idea what Noah is going to do with this information, but I'm sure they know their business better than I do.